In today's discussion, I'm joined by two distinguished experts and ENC academic council members. Starting from Egypt, Dr. Ebtisam Hussein is a tenure holder of political science at Cairo University, who currently serves as Associate Professor of Political Science at New Giza University in Egypt. And from Egypt to Tunisia, to Dr. Emna Ben Arab, who is an Assistant Professor at the University of Sfax in Tunisia. A warm welcome to both of you. It's good to have you, virtually at least, in today's podcast discussion, both you, Ebtisam, and you, Emna.
Oh, thanks much, dear Andreas. I'm always happy to take part in podcasts, and I'm really happy to be meeting Dr. Emna, at least online for the time being.
The pleasure is all mine.
Thank you, Andreas, and great to be part of this.
Excellent. I would like to start our discussion with a general question addressed to both of you, and we'll start first with you, Ebtisam. Now, how do the events unfolding in Ukraine affect the region's political and societal reality? What are the first reactions identified both within the political spectrum, but also from ordinary citizens or businesses in the region? Thank you, Ebtisam. Emna, may I have your take as well on that question briefly?
Sure. So clearly the shockwaves of the invasion are being felt in the countries of the region, and this exacerbates an already volatile situation. So many of the MENA countries are still struggling with the fallout of the pandemic, and now they find themselves in the midst of another crisis that involves their food and energy security, which is likely to lead to a further and deeper social crisis with far-reaching consequences. When it comes to Tunisia, the first reaction of Tunisians across the spectrum is that they are against the war and the massive suffering and devastation that it is causing, and they are sympathetic to the plight of the Ukrainian people. It is perceived that this war is an inexcusable war, and this is reflected at the official level, at the state level, in Tunisia's vote to condemn the invasion in the UN General Assembly. But when it comes to the causes and what got us there, the general perspective, the perspective of the ordinary citizens, their discussions on social media platforms, their perspective is different from the mainstream Western view, which I can summarize in 4 points. So one, there is a consensus that this is a war to redefine the new world order, and the Ukrainian people are caught in the middle. So for this, Russia is not the only one to blame for this conflict. It was pushed to it by the US-led Western camp, which was for some time not sensitive to Russia's security concerns and did not respect their promise of not expanding NATO eastward. Two, it is perceived that Europeans are pushed into a trap, allowing a war to happen again on their continent by the United States, which is now shifting gears toward China, and for whom Europe is no longer a priority. So it is a US war by proxy whose aim is to weaken Russia and also to send a message to China. This is what to expect. Massive economic sanctions and international isolation in case you contemplate an invasion of Taiwan or a unilateral move to annex it. The third point has to do with Putin. Let me say that Putin is, as a leader, is positively viewed by ordinary citizens. He falls into the public prototype of leadership. He is the leader they don't have. So Putin is seen as a strong leader. He re-established the highly centralized leadership. He stood up to the West. He stood for his country's interest, and he was instrumental in making Russia powerful again. And I believe that this is an illustration disillusionment with the Western type of democracy, which is especially fueled by U.S. interventionism. And it is specifically the case in Tunisia, because Tunisians see the U.S. continuing to support those to whom Tunisia said enough is enough, and it is oblivious of what they want for themselves and not fully understanding the situation on the ground. And the fourth point is that they see a great deal of duplicity in dealing with the war from governments as well as the media coverage. There's a lot of support for Ukraine, rightly deserved, of course, while looking the other way when Libya and Syria were destroyed by the same countries, who today clamor the breach by Russia of international law. They also see this duplicity in the refugee issue. So there is the refugee issue of 2015 versus the refugee issue of 2022. Also, they see a lot of praise for what is called the International Legion in Ukraine, which is the foreign fighters pouring into Ukraine, versus foreign terrorist fighters in Syria and Iraq. So all in all, regarding the whole region, I think there are mixed feelings at the citizen level. And at the state level, each country has its geopolitical and economic calculations, and this explains in part the uncoordinated reactions outside the umbrella of the Arab League. I'm talking about the Arab League, and all of us know that it is practically non-existent. And part of this is that Russia has been quite active in the region through the Syrian war, through having now a naval base on Syria's Mediterranean coast. So there are, as I said, mixed feelings, and there are calculations. I mean, some countries in the region are beginning to review their systematic alliance with the United States, and this what makes them refrain from explicitly condemning Russia and President Putin.
Thank you very much, both of you. Now, it was mentioned earlier by Ebtisam about the food insecurity, the food issue in the region. And of course, when it comes to North Africa, and rightfully so, the conversation revolves around this topic that is rising due to the war in Ukraine. Now, for example, Egypt depends on Russia and Ukraine for around 70% of its wheat imports. The same goes for other countries in the region, which are heavily dependent on both of them for their food security. Can you both please describe what is the general sentiment in your countries, but also in the region? I would like to stay actually with you, Emna.
The region relies heavily on wheat imports from Russia and Ukraine. Tunisia, for instance, receives nearly 80% of its wheat from Ukraine. And as a result of the war, wheat prices are the highest in more than a decade. So there is a concern that the sharp increase in wheat prices and the possible disruption of food supply could lead to a wave of social unrest, and that a sizable number of people could be affected by hunger. Today, many politicians talk about the coming revolution of the hungry. So this is a real concern. And in Tunisia, food price rises and supply disruption are already a concern even before the war, which is only exacerbating this concern, leading to a wave of panic by households who are rushing to stockpile all sorts of basic staples, flour, semolina, etc. So there is a real fear that food security is at risk. There is a feeling that this is no longer taken for granted.
Do you believe that the interruption of supply chains during the pandemic, in combination with what's going on in Ukraine, will create an even more negative spiral when it comes to food security in the region? I mean, very briefly.
Okay, sure. Both the health and the geopolitical crises are leading to shortages in the supply of basic food, with the fallout of the pandemic, the current war could lead to a severe food crisis. The Food and Agriculture Organization says that hunger could affect 55 million people across the region. I'm talking about the MENA region. And in this region, many countries subsidize bread and other staples, and hiking prices could bring an end to the whole system. And this is what the IMF, for instance, is demanding from Tunisian authorities, among other things, to reach an agreement that will allow it to access a much-needed loan. So it is demanding lifting subsidies on foodstuffs and energy. And this, historically, not only in Tunisia, historically this led to massive social unrest. I mean, there were the bread riots in Egypt in 1977, in Tunisia in 1983. So, because low and medium income countries in the region rely heavily on wheat from both Russia and Ukraine, this war could lead to severe economic situations, could lead to people facing the specter of famine and starvation. And this situation, if not properly addressed, will increase, I think, the risk of the region plunging into further instability.
It is a country that is not only dependent on Russia and Ukraine for its wheat, as you correctly mentioned. The tourism sector is quite an important one for the country. So both Russian and Ukrainian tourists together encompass a large percentage of the tourism sector. Now, taking also into account the difficulties that the pandemic created for tourism, the economic and diplomatic consequences that Tunisia is facing right now from its internal political situation, but also from the war in Ukraine.
All right. So Tunisia has been grappling with a severe political crisis for some time now, and this is having an impact on its economy. So the country today is in the midst of negotiations with the International Monetary Fund over an agreement that will allow it to address its acute public finance crisis and many other economic challenges facing the country. But in order to meet the conditions set by the IMF, the country needs to freeze public sector wages and lift subsidies, especially, as I said earlier, on food and energy, which are risky moves in terms of social stability. And on top of that comes the war, which exacerbates the already rising food prices, caused mainly by the pandemic supply chains disruption. And this makes the situation really untenable for a big number of Tunisians. Diplomatically speaking, I think Tunisia is already under pressure, given what is perceived as its democratic backslide. And regarding the war, it is caught between the rock of Russia, upon whom Tunisia relies for tourism, food, and trade, and the hard place of the West, on whom keeping Tunisia's economy afloat depends. So right now, this is the situation in this country.
Emna, relating to the question that I asked you, can you explain how this whole situation affects the Tunisian citizens? Because In this series of podcasts, of course, we're interested in finding out how countries in different parts of the world dealing with the crisis and the war in Ukraine from different levels, from the business sector, from the government level, civil society, and the citizens. So I would like to know what is the feeling in Tunisia, like in markets, in bazaars, and if there is any government plan to handle this crisis and protect the citizens from the rising prices.
All right. As I said before, Tunisians are feeling the impact of the whole situation on their daily life, from skyrocketing food and energy prices to fear of Hungary, which, as I said, led households driven by panic to rush on stocking all sorts of staples. And this, of course, exacerbates this cycle of food shortage. So there is food shortage in the country, and people are afraid that this lead to starvation. For the government part, cracking down on monopolistic practices, because the government believes that this problem is due mainly to monopolistic practices. So the government is cracking down on these practices and providing what is called from producer to consumer small markets. And these markets are expected to limit the number of intermediaries in order to lower the prices. So this is what the government is doing, if that is to be called a plan.
Your thoughts?
Right. So at the level of mainstream media coverage, there is some kind of neutrality, not taking sides, trying to report objectively on the war, whereas the social media platforms, the discussions, as I said at the very beginning, revolve, or the bulk of it revolve around condemning the US and taking sides with Russia. So they believe that this is not a war between Ukraine and Russia. The Ukrainian people are caught in the middle, but this is a US proxy war. And also the emphasis is put on the incompetence of the populist government of Zelensky. So this is the president is running the show, and he was the cause of what his country comes to experience. And as I said earlier on, the president, President Putin, is very positively viewed in social media. He's seen, as I said, who stood up to the West and protecting his country's interest. He's the one who is making Russia matter again on the international stage. So you have the mainstream media, which is, as I said, more neutral than the social media, in which people side so much with Russia and blame the United States, and behind it the government of Zelensky.
At this point, I would like to thank you both wholeheartedly, Ebtisam and you, Emna, for your participation and for your invaluable contribution to our discussion and to this series of podcasts. And for our audience, I would like to inform you that the next episode will be dedicated on the impact of the war in the transatlantic relations.